People kept sending me this article ever since I mocked the living hell out of people who are offended by the amount of tits that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 had. But unfortunately, not only it's an article from December, it's way too short to be made a video of. I'd like to make videos a bit longer than 10 minutes because, well, you know exactly why. So this article is way too short for that, and I already did a Xenoblade Chronicles 2 fan service video. I did them twice, actually 3 times. So why would I need to discuss it again? Fine. If you want my thoughts on this really damn old article, here are my thoughts. The argument on this article can be summed up through the first sentence alone. This game is made for lonely, horny boys with no knowledge how women's bodies actually work. In other words, it is made for the weebs. The game knows exactly the target demographic that it's trying to hit, and for some reason the writer of this article is pissed that it does so. Why? Well, the writer has 2 reasons. One is because it will alienate potential players. Okay, there are several problems with that point. The game is certainly not designed to be appealing for the non-weebs out there. The developers clearly know the sorts of target audience that they pander to, as in teenagers in Japan who love to see a JRPG with characters that dress sexy, and weebs around the freaking world. Again, I see no problem with this. A game is made to appeal to the weebs. Oh no, the horror. Please someone stop Galgun 2. The writer then said, I hope there aren't people out there that would buy Xenoblade Chronicles 2 exclusively because of how the women are depicted. Why? There will be people who will buy this game merely because of Pyra's massive tits, and so many high quality waifus to be fair. Seriously writer, why do you take an issue of someone buying a game merely for the tits? Most people would go into this game for the story and the gameplay. Otherwise, they would be going into Pornhub or play Galgun 2 instead. The writer then points out that it certainly wouldn't hurt sales to just at least tone the clothes down a bit. Again, why tone the clothes down a bit? Because you are offended by it? If you want a game that dresses its female characters respectfully, it's called Trails of Cold Steel. This is also a very moot point in retrospect because this game is not only the best-selling game on the series in Japan, but it is also one of the best-selling games in the entire system. That's right, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, a niche RPG title with massive tits, is the best-selling game on the system at the time. So what's that about hurting sales again? The second reason is because it keeps alive some of the worst beliefs about the games and the people who play them. In other words, it makes video games as a medium and gamers in general to look awfully childish and immature. Who the hell cares? As long as the game is fun, entertaining, and visually appealing, why should maturity be something that we strive for? Do I have to quote C.S. Lewis again? Xenoblade Chronicles 2 doesn't have to be the next mature installment in the series. It can just be a stupid, dumb, fun JRPG with tits. This article is ridiculous. It's just the writer complaining about the game's overt sexualization for ridiculously stupid reasons. So why am I talking about this article when I already talk about this topic 3 times already? Well, a patron of mine, Neptunia fan, sent me one hell of an interesting video. It's a video made by a YouTuber named Ludicere about the Xenoblade Chronicles 2 sexualization case study that begins by talking about this article. It's 53 minutes long, and that alone would certainly turn most people off, but hey, 53 minutes video of someone talking about the problematic sexualization of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in great detail? It's much better than anything that I've tackled before involving Xenoblade 2. And if I have to be very fair, this video is actually very well made. It's very well structured. The opinions being delivered are clear and concise. There are citations of books, articles, and even quotes from experts or people who are familiar in the fields. There are research being done in a lot of the topics discussed, more so than my typical videos anyway. And if I have to be honest, I really enjoyed watching it. There are ideas that I severely disagreed, which we'll get to definitely, but there are also some very interesting insights on the game, the story, and the characters. So don't let my criticisms in some, well actually a lot of the points, distract from the fact that this is a genuinely good video with high production standards and clear effort and passion being put into it. So kudos. Especially with the playtime. Goddamn, 245 hours? I barely scraped 80 myself. And now we get into the critiques. But before we get into the critiques of the tits, huge thanks to Asura, Blackmeth, and Dedis for the pledges on Patreon. You guys are fantastic.
There's an article called The Body Horror of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, written by a guy called Garrett Martin. In this article, he basically makes a case against over-sexualization in the game, one of the most revealing lines being the simple, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is full of grotesque distortions of women's bodies. On the other side of this argument, you can find plenty of comments which pretty strongly disagree with the point of this article.
People on the internet comment section have very stupid and ridiculous feedbacks to an article that is also stupid and ridiculous. Nothing to see here, carry on.
Something you see in both the article and the comments is a pretty large number of baseless assertions and accusations. And in the comments, a lot of blanket terms like SJW and feminist being used as slander. I don't like blanket terms at all. The problem here is that vague categorization is too simplified, and painting a whole collective group with the one stroke is not only immature and lazy, but almost always factually incorrect.
I actually agree. Do you see how this video have some good points? Notice how during the first few minutes of the video where I criticized the article, nowhere did I ever use the term SJW or feminist. In fact, I have never done this to anyone that I disagree with, or even people that acts remotely similar to what I would describe as SJWs or feminists. Or at least recently. The reason is because using the term SJW and feminist to describe someone doesn't really mean anything, unless if the person identifies as such. If I go to the creator of this video and just say, OMG, this video is made by a stupid feminist SJW who gets triggered by boobs in a video game, it does absolutely nothing to the conversation, and it's way too easy to do that. I don't like the easy route when dealing with this sort of topic. I will listen to what you say on this matter and try to portray you as fairly as possible. However, I do like my Persona 5 difficulty on safety. Don't at me. And yes, the arguments from the article are still stupid, as you acknowledge on this video as well. Both sides are grossly overgeneralizing their opposing sides to the point of meaninglessness. As you said in the video, the vague generalization from both sides is not only immature and lazy, but almost always factually incorrect. So, yeah, carry on.
For this reason, I've split this video into 6 parts, which you can see on the screen at the moment, with the intention of finding out the extent to which sexualization exists in the game, looking at some of the reasons behind why that is, and having the honest discussion about whether or not it's a problem.
So in the first part, Ludi talks about the male versus female sexualization. The most basic point out of this segment is that women in the game are more sexualized than the men. It's not saying that the men are not sexualized, it's just that pretty much almost every woman in the game are sexualized in some manner or the other. The segment goes into more details about the comparisons between the male characters in the game and the female characters in the game, showing how female characters are without a shadow of a doubt more sexualized than the male characters. Ludi also talks about the difference between being sexy and being sexualized. Being sexy is a subjective characterization. Being sexualized implies intent, which the creator of this game certainly has done to a lot of the female characters, and less towards the male characters. There is clear intent in making these female characters to look as sexually attractive as possible. There's no denying that fact. It's just that I have a couple of problems with this segment. First one being that this entire segment is a response to a comment from the article that only says a very limited sentence. This segment easily could have been a lot shorter if it weren't for you explaining in great detail in how pretty much every main male character in the game isn't sexualized. You provided way too much information to this entire conversation, to the point where not only it feels a bit unfair to the commenter who can only utter a couple of words, but it also unnecessarily spoils a lot of the bits in the game, where it could have been kept away by just saying that they are not sexualized. It drags the video, basically. And then we have this part.
Look, I find it hard to picture myself walking down the street at night and having women drive past me wolf whistling or catcalling or harassing me. But if you reverse the genders, it suddenly becomes more realistic to conceive of, doesn't it?
I have no idea why you have to say that. Is it to highlight that women are treated differently because of their gender? Well, it is obvious and it is unfair in some cases, but I don't see any way for us to change how, for example, men catcall women on the street. Men and women are different. In some cases, there are reasons in why they are treated differently. Some are fair, some are not. I can't comment on that any further because I am no expert on it. I want to focus on the game here, but just for a bit. Here's a very interesting thing that I found out about men and women. Despite the massive amount of sexualization of women in fiction, men's standards of women are lower compared to women's standards of men. Why do I point that out? Well, it's because of this.
In 1975, a film critic called Laura Mulvey conceptualized something which she called the male gaze.
Yes, I know, but bear with me here. So the male gaze is a concept made by a film theorist, Laura Mulvey, in 1975. Damn, that's pretty long. In short, the male gaze is basically the idea that since a certain entertainment medium is mostly populated by heterosexual men, they tend to objectify or sexualize women for, you guessed it, the male gaze. I'm not entirely sure about that. Oh sure, films back then certainly, without a doubt, sexualize women, but I am not sure if the sexualization part was done without the consent of the women involved. I don't know about you guys, but the last time I heard, women desire to look sexy and appealing to the men. And even if they don't do it for the men, looking sexy and appealing is something that will bump your self-confidence. That applies to both genders actually. What if the sexualization part wasn't done by men for men, but by women for men? Or women for themselves? I don't know, just a thought. Ludi then talks about scopophilia, which is basically sexual pleasure from watching others when they are naked or exposing some skin. In other words, very natural human behaviors. I'm not saying that voyeurism or stalking women just because they look hot are totally okay and fine to do so, at least in real life. I'm just saying that being stimulated by a naked body of the opposite sex, or the same sex if you're bi or gay, is healthy and natural. I don't see what's wrong with being scopophilic. Then Laura Malvi explains that the cinema develops scopophilia in its narcissistic aspect. I'm sorry, what? She then proceeds to say that the conventions on mainstream films focus the attention on the human form. Scale, space, stories are all anthropomorphic. Well, it's not that it's wrong, it's just that I don't see how stories in general aren't anthropomorphic, or at least aren't humanized in some way. I mean, sure, there are stories that do not involve human beings at all. In fact, we are currently talking about a game that has a lot of those here. But this paragraph tells me that Laura has an undefined problem with looking at sexy women on cinema, calling the behaviors of being turned on by looking at sexy women as narcissistic. What is so narcissistic about making a movie that has sexy women? What is so narcissistic in watching them? What is so narcissistic in playing a game that has female characters with giant tits? The developers get profits, the customers get tits, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 become the bestseller. I don't see a problem here. And then there's this part. Another segment from the book is talking about how men refuses to see other men naked. I think the reasons are very clear if you're a heterosexual man. It's not appealing. I mean, not for me though. I think fictional 2D men are the absolute best, and 3D men should absolutely burn in a fire. See guys, I'm a true advocate for gender equality. All 3D beings must die. Which is why I show my 2D face here instead of my 3D one. My 3D one just looks... I should burn in the fire actually. Ludi then goes back to the comment he responded earlier and said that he and a bunch of other people are ignorant about the context of the game's target demographic. To put a very long segment short, Ludi's response to this commenter can be boiled down to, the game sexualizes the female characters a lot more than the male characters. It's a game designed with the male audiences in mind. Therefore, the double standards here are female characters being more overly sexualized than men, rather than the other way around. If that's what he's trying to say, I actually agree. To say the men are sexualized as well is a bit unfair, because Xenoblade Chronicles 2, actually come to think of it, my favorite characters in the game are mostly women. I'm still trying to think of a male character that I like in the game as much as, say, Nia, who has not only a great hard-as-nails personality, but also has a really interesting backstory with an intriguing character arc. I also really love Morag and Bridget. Their history, their characters, their dynamic towards each other, both of them are pretty badass in their own ways. Morag's relationship with her little brother, however brief, also adds more layers to her already badass character. And let's not forget Poppi, the most adorable little robot in video game history. Have you seen the way she walks? It's just the most adorable thing in existence. In a lot of ways, this game glorifies the women in both the visuals and the writing, to the point where the men just cannot even compare. So you know what? I may have come into a rather weird conclusion that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 actually hates men. Anyway, moving on to the next segment. The second segment is how the second comment talks about how it's a game where a character's hair is on fire, juxtaposing the game's unrealistic elements with the unrealistic depictions of the characters. Ludi's response is actually a reasonable one here, in that it's unfair to compare the more fictional elements of the game to the less fictional aspects, like the accuracy of the character's body, anatomy, or their human personality and conflicts, which is ultimately what the game is about. It's about the people and the characters involved in the story, so of course there is some semblance of realism. Ludi also brilliantly points out in how the designs of some of the characters match up with their characteristics and personality in the game, pointing out to a Blade that I haven't met yet, Adenine, and commenting how her book's aesthetics match up with the concept and idea that knowledge is power, and Pandoria, whose glasses cover up early in the game, but progressively becomes clear to signify us learning more about the character. The reason why he highlights these two characters is to point out that Pyra's design, on the other hand, is merely for fan service. This is really not a bad point at all, and I actually agree with it. Except for one tiny bit.
There are ways to push the boundaries of realism for the sake of increasing a character's depth, and this is one of the ways to do it. It can be done without compromising a character's identity by making them an object.
Again, let me remind you that, in my opinion, no male characters in the game are about as interesting or likable as the female characters in the game, which means that their fanservice design failed to distract me in how, say, Bridget's backstory and character, and slapping Rex in the face? God damn, girl! You can summon fire out of your ass, but resorting in some good old slap for that whiny bitch? Now that is some high-quality waifu material. The point that I'm trying to say here is that these characters end up not being sexual objects. They may look like sexual objects being sexualized for the male Actually, they are. They are fictional characters. They are clearly objects. But even then, they still end up being really good characters in their own merits as well. It all depends on an individual's ability of looking past all of the fan service nonsense, which is something that you are incapable of. Anyway, moving on to the next point, which is conveniently about relating to characters.
The other thing I want to say in regard to realism is that in media, we want to be able to relate to characters, to be able to take influence from them, emulate them.
Relate? Definitely. Take influence? Probably. Emulate? Persona! I don't think so. Moving on from that point, Ludi basically points out that thanks to the over-sexualization of women, it ignores that these sorts of games are played by women. There are still women who play this game just fine. I knew some of them, in fact. So this is a strange point. You mentioned last time that this game has a men audience in mind, but your argument here is that it ignores the women audience in mind. So are you saying that this game actually has a 50-50 demographic rate? Why should it be evenly distributed, or that we should have more women playing this game? And this is where Ludi absolutely destroys his own point.
I want to say here that Bridget's story and characterization is actually incredibly interesting, and focuses mostly on themes like memory, mortality, what it means to be remembered, what it means to have an identity, and I think that's wonderful. Bridget is actually probably my favourite character in the game, but I can't help but feel that her sexualization was, as you're probably getting sick of hearing, purposeless. Obviously, she's allowed to have a female form. The issue is that her positive attributes take a backseat to her unexplainable physical attributes.
So if you missed that, he said that Bridget is one of his favorite characters purely for the writing. But then he also said that her other character attributes take a backseat to her unexplained physical attributes. I have 3 questions for that. 1, if her character is so great and well written, then why complain on her looks to begin with? Isn't the entire purpose for less sexual objectification in video games is to humanize women and make them strong female characters? You do recognize in this video that female characters can dress ridiculously and still be great characters. So again, why is the dress so important? Why is the sexualization a problem when the character is already great? 2, when you say that the character's personality takes a back seat to the physical attributes, to whom was this preference referring to? It is certainly not me, because Bridget looks like that from the start of the game to the end of the game. She looks sexy, definitely, but then you know her backstory, you know her personality, you know her chemistry with Morag, her chemistry with Rex. These are the things that I find more interesting than her looks. The only person who perceives that her personality takes a back seat to her physical attributes is you. And 3, if a character's dress is purposeless and it's nothing but sexualized, what's the issue? I think your point here is that they could dress more sensibly if there are no other purpose than eye candy. Fair enough, but then again, if both options are not equally wrong, then what's really the issue? It seems that your issue here is that Pyra and Bridget's character designs serve no purpose other than eye candy, which I personally take no issues with, and I still don't understand what's your issue with it. Or is it that your point that they could be better served, and that their clothings can have more meaning? Sure, but then again, not everything should have a meaning. Not everything should have a purpose. If Pyra and Bridget's clothes are nothing but eye candy, then so be it. Again, I just don't really see the issue here. And now I'm going to take one segment from Ludi complaining about Pyra. That just makes me giggle.
What he hasn't justified here, though, is why her boobs are pretty much bigger than her head, and why she's wearing the world's shortest shorts.
Okay, I'm sorry. That just sounds pathetic. That sounds like a girl bitching about how another girl wears prettier dress for prom in high school. I know this is very low, but at the very least recognize that sounds really, really stupid.
It's unfair for any female demographic playing this game to have less opportunity to see strong female characters on account of sexualization at points belittling the genuinely good characterization.
It's unfair because, you said it yourself, this game is intended for men. Sorry to say this, but some games are just not welcoming to women. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with a game that isn't for women. Before you say that bit, you were talking about how the design of the male blades are not sexualized compared to the female blades, and you say that it's unfair, which once again can be explained to the fact that this game is mostly for boys. I just personally don't see the issue of sexualizing fictional characters for both genders actually. Not every game should please both genders. So those are the first two sections of the video, and they are pretty tolerable for my standards. Then we get to Spider-Man 3, and that's where everything goes into the garbage.
Firstly, I want to define feminism, and I'm going to give a few different definitions so we can see they're all saying the same thing, really.
Okay. Alright. Let me guess. Feminism advocates for the equality of men and women by definition, and if you're not a feminist by definition, then you should be, because by definition, it's about advocating for women's rights and the equality of men and women. By definition.
Feminism is the belief and aim that women should have the same rights, power, and opportunities as men. Collins. See, this is what feminism actually means.
Haha, this video is easier to predict than a freaking sunshine. Seriously, man, going into the dictionary definition to defend feminism is so unbelievably 2014. It is a really ancient argument that doesn't work back then and it doesn't work right now. Why doesn't it work? Well, feminism in practice is not the same as feminism in theory. Not even close. In theory, it's about equality of the sexes. In practice, this.
If you're male and you're watching this, do you think you could look your female friends and family in the eye and say to them that you're content that they have it harder than you do for something they didn't choose? See, I couldn't.
Wow. That's a not necessarily darkened, stretch out emotional argument. So section 3 starts off by dismissing radical feminists, not knowing the source of person that defines a feminist, not recognizing the difference between feminism in theory and feminism in practice, and most importantly, implying that if you're not a feminist, then you're a terrible person. By definition, let's not forget that. This is such an ancient argument. This video is made 2 days ago at the time of writing, and yet it felt like something that came out of late 2014. Ludi then proceeds to cite someone who receives abuse online and said that it's unacceptable. This is completely freaking irrelevant. You are correct. You should go back to talking about the game. You did solid jobs in the first 2 sections, but this is where you totally screw up. This is where you totally bomb. You better stop before you screw up even more.
Looking at the backlash at the article I just mentioned at the beginning, you can see exactly what she's described. Even though a man wrote that article, it challenges the phallocentric power dynamic that exists in the gaming community, which immediately garners massive outcry.
The article is trash. I explained why it's trash in the beginning. The points being raised are incredibly questionable at best. The backlash to this trash article is due to the fact that it's trash. Rewind back for more details. I don't know how else should I explain you this.
It's not a can of worms I'm willing to really open too much, but this will all be familiar to you if you know anything about Gamergate.
Surprisingly enough, Ludi didn't elaborate on this further and just moves on to another point, which I would do as well if I have to be honest with you, because Gamergate is dead. It's a dead movement. It's about as relevant as Gangnam Style. Section 4 is where Ludi talks about Poppi. This section is very spoiler filled, but strangely enough, Ludi decides to talk about maid fetish? Weirdly enough, out of all the characters he mentioned as an example, he mentioned Kawakami from Persona 5. You're well aware that most people who play Persona 5 prefer Kawakami in that state rather than her other state, right? The main point that Ludi talks about in section 4 is basically how Poppi, or specifically Poppi QT, is sexualized because she wears a maid outfit, is initially programmed to be a maid of some sort, and her second form has some fan service moments. But then he also proceeds to talk about how Poppi is a great character, which renders his previous complaint about her fan service entirely pointless because the character in question is not an object at all. He just perceived her as one. Also, this bit is pretty funny.
Something's gone wrong in the creative process if sexualized characters are unironically reprimanding sexualization.
Speaking of which...
It's inconsistent to have a character like Bridget scold Tora for misogyny when she herself is a product of that same misogyny.
And that product of misogyny just so happens to be your favorite character in the game. You misogynist. Moving on to section 5, Ludi then talks about best girl and spoiling her best moment, so I'll be better off skipping this section and talk about Morag instead, my second best girl. Oh, and before we get to that...
Nia is a confident female character throughout the whole game, really, and although she still gets the Melia treatment where she's romantically ignored by the protagonist...
I feel you, man. Best girl is not canon girl. Anyway, back to Morag. Ludi then spends talking about how Morag is dressed up as a soldier, therefore she's codified as male, and that we should find a way to dress her up as a soldier without codifying her as male.
If I say the word soldier, the chances are you picture a man. I mean, I do. It's what I'm used to in media.
No. It's because most soldiers are generally men. Not that the media tells me that they're mostly men. They are really, in real life, mostly men. I don't understand why you bring this up.
There's a wonderful character in Persona 4 called Naoto Shirogane who also exhibits intentional gender performativity in order to be taken more seriously in her career.
Hey, at least you didn't claim that she's trans. That's actually commendable. One very bizarre point to end section 5 is where Ludi talks about how women who dress up stereotypically as men limits the way in which strong female characters can be written? How? It didn't hamper Naoto, which you talked about briefly. It didn't hamper Morag. All of these characters are, as you say, still great characters. Looks like the main issue that I got from this video is, despite recognizing that characters are solid and well written, you still have to comment on their appearance and sexualization. All of this is done so that women can feel more included in the gaming space, but as you said, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a game for men. You don't have to make a game that is intended for men to be also for women. Again, the game sells pretty damn well. The developers and publishers know exactly who to market this game for. And they did it. It's a successful game. Why do you have to make a game that is clearly intended for men to be also made for women as well? To rack up more sales? I'm very sure that most JRPG audiences are men. Let me check out the gaming gender statistics based on genre that I got from my previous video. I was correct. It's about 67% male. The female percentage is actually a lot higher than I expected, but it still ends up being mostly men. With that high amount of women in JRPGs, you're implying that 33% of women who play JRPGs are not fine with the depiction of women's sexualization, which is something that is very common in JRPGs. I think I get what you're saying when you talk about how the men don't feel comfortable with other men being sexualized in fiction, which theoretically should apply to this game as well for the women, right? But here's the thing, it is perfectly capable for any genre to be loved by all sorts of demographics, regardless of the genre's intended target audience. My Little Pony, for example, it's a cartoon intended for kids, and yet a lot of adults love it too. I, for example, was really into fanfiction, and you know who makes the most fanfiction? Women. You know what they write in fanfiction the most? Yaois. Do I have to complain to the fanfiction community in how the men are sexualized? I don't, because that's what the women love to do in fanfiction. I recognize its appeal. If you don't recognize the appeal of a certain element, that doesn't mean that the element should be changed or removed entirely. Anyway, let's move on to chapter 6. This is where Ludi talks about Dahlia and he responds to... an article from the Gaming Ground. I follow the Gaming Ground on Twitter, but sometimes their editorial pieces can be so over the top, someone like Ludi can rip it off into pieces and actually come out as the rational one. Let me show you. First off, Ludi explains how he doesn't like blanket terms like SJWs for reasons that I wholeheartedly agree with. This block of text is actually a reasonable complaint, considering what we're gonna deal with in the next part. This is from the Gaming Ground's article, screenshotting a tweet and posting a comment in the bottom. The screenshot is about Dahlia talking about how she loves studying, and the comment in the bottom is talking about how the writer sheds a manly tear, but then says, not that SJWs would care anything about the stuff like that though. What SJWs? Who are the SJWs? Even as someone who is very well versed in this sort of stuff, I have no idea what you mean in that sentence. And thus Ludi second my sentiment and completely destroys you in this part. Now you know why I hate the term SJWs. From that point on, Ludi addresses the problem that I have with the video, which is that a female character who is overtly sexualized can still be great characters. So why the complaints? Please elaborate.
That's the first big issue here, is the assumption that Dahlia cannot be an example of dodgy sexualization if she's got that sweet, doting, motherly vibe. She can. She is. We spoke earlier about how sexualization in design is more than anything about intent. If a reason for her design can't be found, and doesn't exist in a consistent subversion of the game's sense of reality, then it's an example of sexualization. The point I'm making here is that, unsurprisingly, no reason is given.
So, the sexualization of a character needs to have more meaning other than eye candy? I don't think so. Not everything needs to have meaning. Maybe Bridget and Pyra's designs are there just to please the eyes. I see nothing wrong with that. You do. For some reason. And that's the part that I'm really confused at. If you acknowledge that the characters can be both eye candy and have actual depth at the same time, then what's wrong with the eye candy part? Because it pleases men? What's wrong with that? Because it's not welcoming to women? Why does the game have to be welcoming to women? Because it doesn't have depth and meaning? Should it have one? If a character is nothing but eye candy, then I can understand a complaint. But as you acknowledge multiple times in this video, a lot of the sexualized characters in the game actually have good characters and solid writing to the point where even the male characters just couldn't compare in my opinion. You find the characters great, but the outfits sexualized. I see no issue with the sexualization. You do. For really confusing reasons.
I think we've also learned a lot about the people who are opposing positive and realistic representation of female characters.
Actually, no. These people are not against positive and realistic female characters. These people are against positive and realistic female characters by your standards. Your standards is basically female characters shouldn't dress ridiculously for the male gaze. Even if they're solid and well-written characters, they should dress modestly so that women can play this game just fine. But then you also said that this game is intended for men. So why make a game intended for men to be friendlier to the women? I mean, sure, there are 33% or more audiences of JRPGs that are women, but this entire video is under the implication that all of those people are not fine with sexualization of the characters. Maybe it's actually you who are not fine with it, which is fine, but the same thing cannot be said to the JRPG audiences who are women. In other words, don't project yourself on the behalf of women, especially women who enjoy JRPGs, and most definitely do not make strange implications about them.
I think we've also learned a lot about the people who are opposing positive and realistic representation of female characters. You'll notice very few of them are women.
Very few of them are women, and therefore they're wrong? Nice that you cited Violet Zero in there as a bonus because, well, she's a woman, and we're pretty much done. Let's wrap things up here.
I want to be part of an environment in which both games and the gaming community can continue to develop in a positive and inclusive way. Everyone should have the equal opportunity to enjoy games.
Yeah, everyone already does. They do have the equal opportunity to enjoy games. It's just that not every game can be enjoyed by everyone. If women don't enjoy Xenoblade Chronicles 2 due to the overt sexualization, then they can buy Trails of Cold Steel or any other game that doesn't have overt sexualization of women. Not every game should be able to please every demographic. Galgun, for example, is a very heavy fan service game that is just not for me. There's a recent game that I play for practically quite endlessly called PC Building Simulator. This game seriously consumed my life more than expected, and the reason why this game is so successful is because it hits the right audiences. There is a market for people who want to try building PCs, which they don't have the money to have all the components to build PCs. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a game that knows its audiences. It's a game made by weebs for the weebs. It has blatantly shameless fan service, sure, but even with all of that, the female characters still end up being solid, well-written characters, more so than the men actually. In summary, I don't think this is a bad video at all. In fact, I think this is a very well-made video. Sure, it rambles in a lot of the points, and I disagree quite a lot, but the presentation here is certainly much better than most YouTubers around. And unlike the last article that is nothing but outrage clickbait, this is a video that is made out of genuine passion. In a lot of ways misguided, but the amount of work and effort being put into constructing this entire thing, researching the topics, citing the sources, and even playing the game itself, those are the things that, in my opinion, deserve some level of praise. I can even say that if I have zero knowledge of the topic at hand, or if I don't take any position on this matter, I think Ludicero is probably able to convince me to his position on the sheer fact that the presentation of it is really good. So once again, kudos, Ludi. We might disagree with a lot of the topic at hand, but credit's where it's due. If only the people on my side can be just as presentable.